Morgan Freeman hasn't driven a car in 16 years, not 1 mile, not even to the end of his driveway. When an accident survivor asked why, Morgan's confession about panic attacks and PTSD from his 2008 crash left everyone stunned. The Tonight Show studio was alive with its signature Tuesday evening energy in Manhattan. The familiar blue and gold lighting created that warm, electric atmosphere that had made the show a late-night institution for decades. Morgan Freeman sat across from Jimmy Fallon, both engaged in what appeared to be a typical celebrity interview about his legendary career and recent projects. The Roots had just finished their smooth musical transition, and the cameras were rolling hot. Jimmy's iconic curved desk gleamed under the professional studio lights, while the New York City skyline sparkled through the backdrop windows like a constellation of cinematic dreams and storytelling history. Morgan looked every inch the distinguished legend he had become. At 88, he still possessed that unmistakable presence and commanding voice that had captivated audiences for over 5 decades, though now there was a subtle weariness in his movements, a careful way he held his left hand that spoke of battles fought and adjustments made. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit with his signature earring catching the studio lights, he radiated the same profound gravitas that had made him one of cinema's most respected figures. "So, Morgan," Jimmy said, his animated gestures punctuating every word, "at 88, you're still making movies, still that incredible voice that we all recognize instantly. When people hear Morgan Freeman, they think of wisdom, of strength, of someone who's seen it all. What keeps you creating at this stage of your life?" Morgan's eyes held that characteristic depth and thoughtfulness. "Well, Jimmy, I think as long as there are stories to tell, as long as there's something meaningful to contribute, you keep going. Age doesn't stop the desire to connect with people, to share something that might matter." The audience was clearly mesmerized by his presence and the weight of his words. Several older fans in the front rows leaning forward with obvious reverence for this living legend. "And you've certainly lived through a lot," Jimmy continued with obvious respect. "The career, the experiences, the challenges. I know you've faced some significant health issues over the years. How do you maintain that incredible strength and perspective?" Morgan's expression became more reflective, and there was something in the way he shifted slightly in his chair, the way his left hand remained carefully positioned, that suggested layers of experience beyond what was immediately visible. "Strength is a funny thing, Jimmy," Morgan said, his voice carrying that familiar weight and wisdom. "People assume that because you've survived certain things, you've conquered them. But sometimes survival just means you've learned to carry what you can't, overcome." The conversation was flowing naturally, touching on his recent film work, his approach to selecting roles, and how his perspective on life had evolved over the decades. The studio audience was completely engaged, hanging on every word from one of entertainment's most revered voices. "Speaking of challenges," Jimmy said gently, "I know you've been very open about the car accident you had in 2008. That must have been a life-changing experience. How do you reflect on that period now?" Morgan paused for a moment, his left hand moving almost unconsciously to rest more carefully in his lap. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more measured, as if he were choosing each word with particular care. "That accident changed everything, Jimmy, not just physically, but in ways that people don't see, ways that I've learned to live with rather than overcome." It was in this moment of reflection about hidden struggles that a voice from the audience cut through the studio atmosphere with the recognition and vulnerability of someone who understood trauma from the inside. "Mr. Freeman?" Both Morgan and Jimmy turned toward the sound. In the third row, slightly left of center, an older man in his 70s was standing among the seated audience members. He had graying hair and wore a simple brown sweater, but there was something in his posture, something in his eyes, that immediately caught Morgan's attention. "Yes, sir," Morgan responded immediately, his voice carrying the respect and attention he had always given to his audience. "What's your name?" "My name is David," the man replied, his voice steady but emotional. "David Rodriguez from Phoenix. I was in a car accident 3 years ago, and I recognized something in how you hold your hand." "David from Phoenix," Morgan repeated, and in that moment, something shifted in his expression. Not the performer's mask, but genuine recognition of shared experience. "You're a survivor too." David nodded, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I haven't driven since my accident. My family thinks I'm being stubborn, but the truth is, I'm terrified. Every time I see car keys, I have panic attacks. The studio fell completely silent. This wasn't just a fan sharing admiration. This was one trauma survivor reaching out to another about the invisible wounds that never fully heal. I need to ask you something that's been haunting me, David continued, his voice gaining strength through his vulnerability. Everyone talks about how you've overcome your accident, how strong you are, but the truth is, I don't feel strong at all. I feel broken. Do you still struggle? The silence that followed was profound. This wasn't just about physical recovery or medical procedures. This was about the psychological aftermath that follows trauma, the fear that reshapes how you move through the world. Morgan stared at David for a long moment, clearly wrestling with memories and emotions that he had kept largely private throughout his very public recovery. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, more vulnerable, stripped of the commanding presence that had become his trademark. David, Morgan said softly, what I'm about to tell you, I've never said in any interview in 16 years. Without hesitation, without consulting producers or following any talk show protocol, Morgan Freeman slowly stood up from his chair and walked directly into the audience toward David. May I sit with you for a moment? Morgan asked as he reached David's row, his left hand noticeably more careful as he moved. David nodded through his tears, and the surrounding audience members quietly made space. Morgan sat down beside him, both accident survivors now facing each other in this profound moment of shared understanding about trauma and survival. To answer your question, David, Morgan began, his voice now carrying the weight of hidden truth. I haven't driven a car since August 3rd, 2008, not 1 mile, not even to the end of my driveway. The studio audience gasped quietly. This was clearly far beyond what anyone had expected to hear from someone who had become a symbol of dignity and strength through adversity. Every day my driver comes to pick me up, Morgan continued, his voice growing more emotional with each revelation. Not because I can't physically drive, my hand works well enough, but because every time I sit behind a wheel, I have a panic attack. Jimmy had left his desk and was now standing at the edge of the stage, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in its honesty. The accident wasn't just about the physical injuries, David, Morgan said, looking directly into the other man's eyes. It was about realizing how quickly everything you think you control can be taken away. In 1 second, 1 moment of lost control, everything changes forever. The emotion in his voice was palpable as decades of carefully maintained public composure gave way to the truth of ongoing struggle. People see me in movies, hear my voice narrating documentaries, and they think I've moved on, Morgan continued, carefully flexing his left hand. But the truth is, I live with the fear every single day, not just of driving, but of all the ways that life can change in an instant. David was nodding knowingly, clearly understanding this exact experience of hidden terror masked by public functioning. But here's what I've learned, David, Morgan said, reaching into his jacket pocket with his good hand and pulling out a small, worn photograph. This is from the accident scene. I keep it not to traumatize myself, but to remember that I survived something that should have killed me. He placed the photograph in David's hands, though David didn't look at it, understanding instinctively that its value was symbolic rather than visual. I want you to have this, David, not to frighten you, but to remind you that survival doesn't mean you have to drive again. It doesn't mean you have to be fearless. It just means you found a way to keep living with the fear. The studio was completely silent, except for the soft sounds of people being moved to tears by this unexpected moment of radical vulnerability. What about the shame? David asked quietly. The feeling like you're not the man you used to be? Morgan was quiet for a moment, clearly accessing memories that were still painful. I used to drive everywhere, David. Loved road trips, loved the independence. After the accident, I felt like I'd lost part of my identity as a man, as someone who was capable and self-sufficient. The audience was witnessing something that transcended entertainment and touched the core of human experience with trauma and identity. But David, Morgan continued, I realized that my worth as a person isn't measured by whether I can drive a car. It's measured by how I've learned to ask for help when I need it, how I've adapted to new limitations, how I've found other ways to be independent. He began removing his navy blue jacket with careful movements, clearly mindful of his left hand. "David, this jacket has been with me through interviews where I pretended that my accident was just a medical inconvenience I'd overcome. Tonight, it goes home with someone who understands that some traumas change you permanently, and that's okay." David, now wearing Morgan's expensive jacket, looked somehow validated, not healed from his trauma, but less alone in carrying it. "And David," Morgan concluded, "I want you to know that every day I choose not to drive isn't a day I've failed. It's a day I've chosen my mental health over other people's expectations. That's not weakness, that's wisdom." Jimmy, his voice thick with emotion, addressed both men. "This is extraordinary. You're talking about redefining strength, about finding courage not in overcoming fear, but in living honestly with it." Morgan turned to address the cameras directly, his voice regaining some of its familiar authority, but retaining its new vulnerability. "To anyone watching who's been in an accident, who's developed fears that other people don't understand, who feels shame about the ways trauma has changed them, you don't have to be the person you were before. You just have to be honest about who you are now." The show ended differently that night. No standard closing monologue, no promotional segments, just Morgan and Jimmy sitting with David as the credits rolled, three people connected by the understanding that sometimes recovery doesn't mean returning to who you were. Sometimes it means accepting who you've become. When the episode aired 2 weeks later, it became one of the most watched Tonight Show segments, featuring a Hollywood legend in the show's history. The hashtag #MorganFreemanTruth trended globally as millions of viewers shared their own stories of post-accident trauma and driving anxiety. David became an advocate for accident survivors and PTSD awareness, speaking at support groups about the reality of ongoing fear and redefining courage after life-changing events. His message resonated particularly with older adults who had experienced accidents and felt pressure to get back to normal when their psychological wounds remained profound. He always wore Morgan's jacket to these appearances. The impact of that conversation extended beyond David and Morgan. Driving instructors and therapists began developing specialized programs for accident survivors, recognizing that traditional approaches often ignored psychological trauma. Medical professionals started incorporating discussions about driving anxiety into accident recovery protocols. Morgan never spoke publicly about changing his approach to discussing his accident, but those close to him noticed something had shifted. In subsequent interviews, he began acknowledging more openly the psychological impact of trauma and the ongoing nature of recovery from life-changing events. The photograph that Morgan had given to David became a powerful symbol in trauma recovery communities. Evidence that survival itself is victory, regardless of limitations that might follow. David often told audiences that he never looked at the image, but kept it as a reminder that surviving trauma doesn't require returning to your previous self. And every time someone praised Morgan for his courage in overcoming his accident, he thought about David Rodriguez and the night he finally admitted that courage isn't about conquering fear. It's about learning to live authentically with trauma, finding new definitions of independence that honor both your limitations and your capacity for meaningful connection.